And we're good up the back? All right, excellent. So let's kick off. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. And I wanted to start off this morning just saying that building consistent, reusable code and maintainable code in the front end is freaking hard. I've been doing this, it is hard. Like for really big companies, it's really hard. And I've been building front-end applications for everyone from large organizations to startups to massive government organizations. And we always end up in the same place, chasing the same things. So today I wanted to share with you my journey to the Holy Grail and how I'm building micro front ends with reusable web components and design tokens, and look at some of the challenges that you'll face and see whether or not this might be something you want to take a real good look at, and whether or not it's actually a path you might want to walk down. So my name's Duncan, and I've been kind of pushing this space of front-end development for over a decade now, and I'm pretty excited to share with you, some of the latest adventures in this space around this topic. So why web components? Well, at the moment I work for the federal government, and we're building their next generation of reusable components and their design system. So for us, it's all about this. We want to be able to have web components that we can run in lots of different places. So we want to be able to run it in Angular, we want to be able to run it in React, we want to run it in, help us, Adobe Experience Manager. We've got content management systems. Who's using AEM here? Okay, it's pretty popular, no one. But we've got it. It solves a problem for us, definitely. But we need to be able to run it in all these different sort of places. And we're pretty bullish on web components for that reason. Like Brad Frost would say in this space, he's bullish around web components if you have this problem. But there's another problem that it helps us solve, and that is we're doing micro front ends. So for us, we have something like this where we want to run all of these web components in all these different frameworks also on the same page. So we want to have like a CMS wrap this with using this blue web component button here in the top. We also want to be able to do this with having like a section in the middle that would be a micro front end for Angular, and then we want to do it again for React, all on the same page. So these web components are helping solve that problem for us also. But we have another problem that I want to talk about today, and that's having reusable styles. And that's where design tokens are helping us solve something like this, where all of a sudden we might need to change, say, the primary color for our brand. The business gets together and they go, yeah, we're going to change, this happens, merges, policy changes. We're going to change from a blue color, I've got to check this, blue to a green color. So how do we actually do this in the wild is normally we would, in a bigger company, we would hit up the design team and would say to them, hey, can you send me the link to your design tool? I need to get that latest color. And you'd go over there and you would find it, and you'd probably copy it, and then you'd come back to your code base and paste it in there. And that might sound like a small problem, but we're all, as developers, very aware of copying and pasting and the challenges around that. So for us, design tokens like this, which is just a key value pair of some design token, like color primary set to a variable, and we can version it and we can put it in code, is really helping us, because if we needed to make this brand change, we can just simply put a new value to it, bump the version, ship a new package, and all those downstream people can then use this design token. So these are all, it's simple, yeah? This is all the same stuff we've been doing in code for years, but being able to apply it to some of our styles. So we're going to be talking more about these today and how we get them into our code base. But we have many different design systems. We don't just have one, we've got lots of departments, and that means more than one design system. And those design systems are used by more than one team, and those teams have more than one project, and those projects have more than one repository. So it gets very meta for us to be able to support all of these environments that we can't just have one React for everything. So this gets quite challenging. And you might be sitting here today going, well, I don't quite have that problem at the moment as a dev. I've kind of got two big apps maybe, and they're all in one space, all in one framework. But hopefully this gives you a glimpse of what it would be like if you're traversing around in your career to what you would be in for if you were to go into a really meta environment like this. And we've got heaps of problems. This isn't unique to us. This is all big companies. We copy and paste code between our micro front ends. We have Angular, React, and you name it, CMSs, Android, iOS, lots of places that need those design tokens. And we have a constant stream of new projects starting all the time. I get called every day, hey, is the new stuff ready? Do we use the old stuff? Do we use new stuff? They're always trying to not recreate the wheel. And we have ever-evolving design systems, which is good. Even when we pick up something to build, that design system is changing over the 2-week period of us doing, the first cut of some component that we're building. So you need to be able to keep in pace with all of that. We have release deadlines. All of our feature teams, they can't stop to solve this problem for anybody else. So we've got all the normal big problems that a big company would have. And they have to be accessible, these components that we're building. We can't afford as a large business to be able to ship anything that's not highly accessible. So we need all of these things. But it's not our first rodeo. This is actually our third go at this. We've 2017, 18-ish, we started off with one in React. And then kind of a year or so later, another team started off one in Angular. And these are hugely successful, used by dozens and dozens and dozens of but dozens of teams to ship production sites. But inevitably, they've gotten kind of end of life, and now we're starting a third one. And I kind of think that's for a few reasons. One reason is they're siloed to Angular or React, and we just have too many different platforms that we have to support. So we can't just rewrite into React or Angular. And the second thing is the web's really evolved. It's very easy to ship a website at the moment that will now, this year, there's 50 kilobytes to ship a web page to the browser. Whereas in the past, that was a lot harder to do. And these older kind of kits that we have, they've got fonts and all the styles, and it's hard to just use a button and just pay a little bit. You're going to pay a lot if you're going to bring in some of our older ones. And I think the third thing for me is it's too developer-centric. The developers had the say in everything, and they built most of these kind of component kits and design systems in collaboration with the designers, but not enough collaboration. And for that reason now, a lot of that secret sauce is just baked into this one downstream section of code, and it's very hard to get buy-in, and it's kind of naturally dying for that reason. And I'll talk a little bit more about the team in a second. So start of this year, we kicked off, we're about 6 months in, we got the team together, we got buy-in for us to restart with web components and design tokens and have another crack at this. And we're just at the point of piloting what we've got. So that kind of terminology of like piloting your work like a TV series coming from Dan Mile and Brad Frost, some voices in this community. So we're not at the very beginning, it's not our first rodeo, but we're definitely kind of relearning a whole bunch of stuff as we go here with these new technologies. So what are we going to cover off today? We're going to talk about the team that you need to pull this off. We'll talk about why web components, a little deeper of why web components. We'll talk about Stencil Js, which is the component library we use. We'll talk about how do we get our design tokens into code, how do we do it as a team. And then we'll talk about the tools and packaging we're using, because it's very different than shipping a web app. We don't have a web app. So what do we use to actually do everything? So talking about team structure, who you have on the bus is really important for this. To be successful in this space, you're going to need to have the right team. And if you just grab a couple of full stack devs and start building components, you're not going to build something as awesome as if you have a designer or designers and you have a specific type of front-end developer. So I really like this quote from Adobe. It's kind of over 2 slides. They go on to say, digital experiences are collaborative. You need this shared language. And it's this shared language that becomes the design system across developers and designers, and it's used to be able to talk about, colors, character styles, and components. And I like this because it's talking about design and devs. You need these people on the team, but it also puts me in my box as a developer, because components are just this little part of this bigger picture, and they're kind of downstream, which you'll hear me talk about. So you really need this cross-cutting team. So you'll commonly see people banter around about this, saying, hey, you should have a team that looks like this. This comes a lot from Nathan Curtis, who's very popular on Medium. And he'll be like, you need a designer, you need a developer, you need this kind of like glue person that's kind of between design and dev and project management. And for me, in our team, that's me. I definitely cut code and I help, but I'm also kind of responsible to make sure I'm getting out into the broader teams and making sure we're going to be making something awesome for our stakeholders. But this front-end developer, or we've got 2 others, so we're kind of muscled up at the moment, which is good. But you want the front-end developer. So if you think that I mean a back-ends for front-ends pattern, which I reckon Jason might have been thinking, you're not the front-end developer that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a front-end developer that has a certain set of skills for making these low-level components. So I'll share these slides afterwards. This is a link to people talking about this, but Brad Frost and the Storybook team banging on about this front-end developer that you need. So you really want them to have these skills, focused on styling, accessibility, HTML, this kind of low-level stuff. Whereas this back end of the front-end developer, they're kind of more of a traditional developer. They've got to focus on patterns and build and outputs and speed and performance and architecture and all those sorts of things. But it is really important because they're going to spin their wheels if this is the first time they've ever built their own custom select and they have to deal with keyboard navigation and those sorts of things. So you really do want to think about the type of front-end developer that you get on your team. But we have an extended team. Quite lucky, and I probably should put our accessibility peeps on the other slide because they're really important for us, and we're really lucky we have 3 of them. They're not in my team, but we can counsel them, and they can help us. Well, they help us at the very beginning, even just deciding how we're going to build a component, but then they help us when we put them all together and make sure that we haven't stuffed anything up. But they're really important for us. Our architects are important. They sold the story and now we have to deliver it, but they've run off as architects do. But we also need our project teams. Our project teams need to dog food this. We need to pilot with them. We need to build these under pressure of actually trying to make a web page rather than trying to finish all our components and then come back. And you need the internets. Like it might sound funny, but all of this stuff around design tokens, web components, it's kind of 1-2 year-ish people have been talking about it. So if you're going to be in this space, you really are going to need to be research heavy and look at what a lot of other companies are doing, because there isn't just one book to pick up or one Pluralsight course and you're like, I just spent 8 hours and I know it now. And your company is going to be unique because you're huge and you're going to have to come up with your own way of doing secret sauce and blend it in with what you see from everyone else. So it's definitely a research heavy sort of space to be in. You're going to have to go look at what a lot of other people are doing. Web components. So why web components for us? We touched on that big point already for us. We want to be able to achieve this. We want to be able to have Angular, React, and so forth. But I want to run through some of the kind of details of why web components make this possible, and also share with you some of the prickly parts of web components that aren't so great. But in general, like I said, we're very bullish. So we want to be able to run it everywhere in all these different frameworks. But to be clear, it would just be heaps easier to do this in React, honestly. Or Angular. Is that okay? Okay. So I'm not married to anything in terms of frameworks. I love them all. But it would be much easier just to do this. If you're a shop that's just got 1 or 2 really big sites, it'd be much easier to just do this in that platform, because you're going to be able to go get amazing libraries that have already solved all the component problems for you. Like in the React space, you've got like stitches and headless UI and all these other sorts of things, Chakra UI, that you can apply your design tokens to and your design system to. And it might even also be easier just to have 2 copies. One in, let's say you're going to get in trouble here from the front row, but Angular and Vue. And it might just be easy even to have 2 copies if you're big enough of those components. But at the same time, that has its own challenges. It's not easy in big companies. We've gone down the path of web components. So this is what they look like if you're going to use a vanilla JavaScript web component. You don't have to read all of this, but you can see at the top, we're making a hello world component that extends HTML element. If you skip all the middle, zoom to the bottom, you'll see a p tag that we're returning that's just the word hello and some name variable. So I'm just going to pump out onto the page hello Duncan or something like that. Now, this will run anywhere. It's a web standard. I just open a script tag, I define it for the browser using browser standards, and then I can use that HTML element and it works, which is great. Ironically, you never get to write vanilla JavaScripts like this because we all use a framework still or a library to write our web components, but they compile down to this web standard and you can use them everywhere. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. And it's based on 3 standards. You've got HTML templates, which gives you like my hello world component, and then you've got your HTML templates, which give you a template markup, and also really importantly slots, so that you can have your consumers pass in a slot of HTML. And then we've also got Shadow DOM, which I'll talk about a whole bunch, which is kind of really unique because you don't have to deal with Shadow DOM as a normal dev, but in the web component world, it's day to day. You're going to have to deal with this. And it's awesome and prickly at the same time. And all of these are web standards. If I go to the canonical Can I Use website and search for web components, you'll see that it's green across the board for all the evergreen browsers, except for the obvious one, which is Internet Explorer. But if we've been paying attention with Internet Explorer, only last couple of weeks, Microsoft like end of life, we're not supporting it. You shouldn't support it. It's not safe to use. And I can see some smiles. And I think as a developer, you've got license now to go push back and say, we shouldn't be using it. Like it's just not supported. And it's really stopped keeping up years ago. So this Shadow DOM thing is one of those standards that IE won't support, but we don't have to worry about that. But it's important because we get CSS encapsulation from it. So here we can see a normal DOM tree that's in the light DOM, as we would say, and we've got the shadow host, which is the start of our web component. And that web component has its own shadow tree or its own DOM tree that's separate from the main DOM tree. And that's the important takeaway, that you have to cross this shadow boundary, and that gives you this CSS encapsulation and other encapsulation that's awesome and a little bit prickly at times. So when you actually go look at it, when it's rendered out, it looks like this. Light DOM, main DOM tree, normal HTML, same thing, but just encapsulated in your shadow DOM for your web component. And this is what it would look like if you inspect the tools. Looking at the same thing, you can see here in red, this is my shadow DOM, my own little very tiny piece of HTML. And I've got this encapsulation of CSS, and I've got my shadow host outside of that red, which is this hello-world tag. And this ability to do this is great, which I'll run through now, and also some things are annoying. So one of the big challenges with web components for years, and somehow it snuck up on us. I went to the Polymer conference in 2016 in Europe, and Polymer was the big hit, and it took all that time until we're actually in the real world building with them, more prolifically. So over that time, one of the challenges to solve was, it's great now I've got CSS encapsulation, I don't have these clashing styles or these bleeding CSS, but what about all the global styles that I do want to control and not have in every component and share? Well, that's where CSS variables have really been our savior as another web standard that we can use. And if you're going to use web components, you're going to be all in with CSS variables because they can cross the shadow DOM. So here we've got the most simple one with the dash notation at the front, which says this is a CSS variable, and you can set a value to it. But you can compose them, which is great. So here I have another one, which is a dash border primary, and I am using the first CSS variable there inside of it with the var function. So they work very similar to Sass variables. They compile very differently in terms of when they're executed, but in general, they're pretty similar. So they're great, and you're going to be all in with web components. I can also there's lots to talk about. I can do little overrides like with this green here as well. And again, same story, green across all the browsers for evergreen. You can use these things. You don't have to worry about it too hard. One of the great things about this, we don't need to use all of these naming strategies like BEM or block element modifier. In the past, I'd use this quite a bit. It's quite a neat little convention of having underscores and double dashes to say this is styling for this component, don't clash with that component. Because I'd do things like this where I'd put these prefixes and these double dashes. But I don't have to do that anymore. I can kind of go, oh, I like it, but I just don't need it. I can make my own button component. Don't even need to put a class on the top. I could. And I can start using our company's language with a variant of danger. And then inside of this web component, there's a couple of things to run through here. It's different with the way you'd style them with Shadow DOM. First of all, this state danger at the bottom, I don't need to put button in front of it. I'm inside the shadow DOM. I can just simple things get simpler. I don't have to worry about it clashing with a drop-down state danger. And the other thing is this host. Here you can see I'm using CSS variables everywhere. And this host is in the light DOM, and I'm saying these CSS variables, you can override those if you want. And we have natural namespacing by selecting the shadow host, which would be my dash button, open some braces, and inside of there I can just override this dash color. So it's a very different way, kind of syntactically of writing it, but it kind of neatens everything up. Now, these pixels that I've got here as well, we don't have too much of that. Probably 9 times out of 10 what you'd see is we'll have a design token that will come in from a different library, that's upstream from us, and we'll compile them into CSS variables. So most of the time you're using named things that are versioned, and this is really cleaning up a lot of our code in terms of being able to have that confidence to change these styles across many teams. Other really cool thing about web components, I spend most of my time on these two doc sites, which is really cool rather than spending all my time on the React or Angular or Vue sites. And that's great because these things are web standards. They move like glaciers. They don't come and go very quickly. You can really invest your time to learn them and build with them because you're going to take them to the next project and the next project and so forth. So that's one of the really cool parts of using web components. Another really cool part of using web components, you could do this in React or Angular or Vue, is stopping to bake in accessibility. But it's a big part for us, so I wanted to mention it. But you could do this if you're building it not using web components. Because if you have a component like this, a simple input form has a label and an input, and you've got this for property on the label, and you're saying, hey, this has got the same ID as the input, because now the assistive screen reader can marry those up, know there's an association, and make a better call for the screen reader on how to do this. Easy at this point. Gets a little bit harder for the developer when you add a third element and you say, oh, but now you need to know to do, just off the top of your head, to do an aria describe by and marry up the next ID. So one thing you can do is just be like, well, we're going to own that. We're going to make a component. So here's a my-input, and you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Here's just what you need to give us. You want text, not numbers. You want a label. You want an error. Lots of properties. And we'll just render and we'll deal with all that accessibility for you in one spot. And if something goes wrong with it and our accessibility team want to change the way we do it, we change it here, it goes everywhere. Okay, because as I mentioned, out of the box accessibility, big deal. Big companies, they really can't afford not to get this right. Okay, the grass isn't always greener with web components. I like to stop and share some of the war stories. It's not all ponies and unicorns on the beach. So what are the prickly parts of this? I think the big one for me is you're going to write more code with web components. You're going to write them once, you're going to test them once, and you're going to ship them everywhere, but you're going to write more code. And one of those reasons is, you're wrapping all of these native elements with Shadow DOM. So you would have, this is an extreme example, but this is coming from a library called Crayons from Freshworks that are using Stencil as a library to write web components like we are. I'm not picking on it. I really like their library. I'm just using it as an example to say, if you have an input with all these native abilities that you can use, you're going to need to wrap it in some Shadow DOM, and then you're going to need to capture them on the host and pass them down. So you've got all these different things here that you're going to have to pass down. So inputs have a lot. So placeholder, min length, max length, min, max, read only, required, steps, type, value. I think you get the point. And then I've got to capture some of these events on input, on blur, on focus. And you can see that I actually deal with these events a lot, and we have to keep bubbling them up. So you do this in other component libraries, but you do it a fair bit more in web components. So you're going to write more code. This is an extreme example, but even something like a button or something else, you think about the native things that it has that you also want in your button, you're going to need to double handle a bunch of things. Other part prickly about web components is forms. So there's some evolving standards for dealing with forms in most of the browsers, not Safari. And that means that Stencil, which we use, are like, it's not quite there yet, here's a workaround for it. They're not baked in and bought in on that standard yet for dealing with forms. And the problem is that you've got Shadow DOM for a button. So imagine you have a submit button, and in a normal form, you hit the submit button and it submits the form, just normal HTML. But if that button is your button and it's a web component and it's inside of Shadow DOM, you hit the submit button and it goes, I don't know about a form. And you're like, oh, and you go down the rabbit hole. But this is copied from Ionic, who made Stencil, which we'll go on to show you. But basically what they say is if you hit the submit button, this is their workaround, and you're inside of a form. And the way they do that is they go, I'm going to crawl out of the Shadow DOM into the light DOM with this element.closest. Browsers can handle the performance, and it starts crawling out and it goes, oh wait, I am inside of a form. And it goes, that's good. Now I'll do the if statement. It goes, great, make me a fake button. set its type, make it invisible, jam it into the light DOM, click the thing, and then remove it. And you're like, oh, I'll just scoot this through my PR, like make sure no one sees. It's easy to test, you can wrap it up into a helper, but these are some of the edges around web components that I see someone taking a picture, I'm gonna get in trouble. But that's something you've got to think about and you're going to have to deal with. We do this, it works, it's not too hard. And in time, this standard around forms will just be there and we'll not have to do some things like this. Another thing is server-side rendering. So it's very, very common in the front end at the moment to render your HTML on the server in Node. There's no browser there, so there's no shadow DOM there, so you can't render HTML web component there. But all the main libraries have some sort of workaround for this. So Stencil's got you covered, you can use, they'll compile out a version that can run in the server. Lit has also got like a beta thing that you can use. And the other one from FastUI, which is Microsoft's web components, which is worth checking out. They've just said, hey, we've got a beta SSR as well. So you end up using a library to write your components anyway, and they've all got a workaround. But my point is, Shadow DOM's awesome, really love it, but you work harder for it, and it's kind of unique. You don't have to deal with this in normal frameworks. All right, so how do we write ours? We use Stencil Js, which I think is awesome, and I'm going to run through some of the awesome points, but I'll show you some alternatives that you could be using as well. So the first reason I really like Stencil JS as a library for writing our components is that it's made from Ionic and it's battle hardened for that reason. Ionic makes hybrid mobile apps, and they had this problem. They're like, we need people to use React and Angular and Vue, but we want them to use our components, so they made Stencil to solve that problem. So you really get that feeling when you're using Stencil that they've solved this problem before for millions of people who use Ionic. And you can go steal a lot of their code. It's open source, not quite right for everyone's project, but you can still get a lot from it. So that's one of the big benefits of using Stencil in my mind, is it's battle hardened. The other thing is it's pretty simple to use. It's very much like Angular and React had babies. I probably just upset everybody and divided the room, but it is, and it's for this reason. It's a hello world component in Stencil, and it's like Angular because they use decorators. So here you can see they've got this decorator and they're annotating the class saying, hey Stencil, this is the information you need to know to make this a Stencil component. But then at the bottom, they've got a render function and they're using JSX or TSX. It's all in TypeScript with Stencil. So that's pretty cool. I think it's pretty easy. If you've used a front-end framework before, first day, you'll get it, you'll be up and running, and then you can spend your time to master it. Their docs are awesome. Easy to search, quite small, based on web standards. You don't spend too much time here, you spend more on the other docs, but they've kind of covered the stuff that's edgy, like bundling and styling, and give an opinion on those things. They also solve a really big problem that you're going to face, is that you're still probably going to wrap your web components to use with frameworks like React and Angular. So out of the box, this is all that you need to do for Stencil to go, great, I'll take all of your core web components, I'll wrap them in an Angular wrapper, and I'll deal with all the lazy loading and making the Angular module and React modules and making it in the React syntax of a sentence case versus a spinal case and so forth for your HTML elements. So this is really cool and it solves a lot of the problem, but what it doesn't do for you is package it up and put it on NPM. That's a web thing. You're still going to have to go do that yourself. You've got to figure out how to deal with change logs and version control, and you're going to need to go get ng packager. So you're still going to drop some time here building your own packages, but they've solved this problem for you. It looks the same with React. It's pretty easy to get started. They have just a simple script you run, and it will spit out some folders like this, and you can get started using Stencil. Here's the opinionation of what unit testing you should do and everything else. Works great. We use this, and then when we want to bring on a new design system that has components that are specific to that design system that don't make sense to put in core, we do this again, and we just put their ones over in their own one. So it's really good. It's doubled in size over the last 2 years, which is great, because you can find hacks to your problems, like that form problem I showed you before. There's enough of a community, people talking about it, which is always something that's good when you're using a framework. And web components in general, they're trending, it's good. So in my opinion, Stencil's awesome, but it's not the only one that you should look at. We all got to be careful when we choose technology. So if you're at the very beginning of this journey, you're looking what web component compiler should I use? I think probably the other big one to look at is from Google called Lit Element. So I'm not going to go into a deep comparison of the two. You can go do that. I just wanted to point out that it's awesome as well, and it's worth checking out. It's the next incarnation of Polymer, which was their first kind of web component library. And if you compare them next to each other, not to say one's better than the other, you can see Lit's more popular, more downloads every month. But really what I think is interesting here is they're both trending up. So that's really cool. We're seeing more people have a crack at web components in the wild and more downloads. But it's still a bit of a niche. If you bring in React, then you're in the hundreds of thousands, and these other big frameworks are in the millions. So it's something to consider when you're doing your due diligence, when you're picking a new framework. All right, moving on to talk about design tokens and how do we get them in code. So this is a really important one, and every day that I'm working on this project, because I don't just get to focus purely on the components, even though they're the most fun bit to me, is that this has the biggest impact to affect more teams and have a broader ability to solve a problem and engage both parties. So as I said, they're just key value pairs, but they're platform agnostic. So they're not already in CSS, they're just key value pairs, and you transform them to where you want them. So you might want them in Android, you might want them in Flutter, all sorts of places. And they look like this. And you're probably looking at this like me. I always annoying my designer. I'm like, hey, here's another one from the wild. And I'm gonna get blocked soon. But it's good because you're gonna have to run around looking at how everyone's doing this, because there's no simple way of doing it. You're gonna have to come up with your convention. So here we've got Spectrum dash, which is Adobe Spectrum is the design system. Global for the space or the level. Color, static, blue, 600 is the scale, and it's set to blue. And you're like, yeah, it's a pretty yuck name. But it makes sense. There's just enough context here. So these names are really tricky, and it's a huge rabbit hole. Like, we've spent hundreds of hours across our team trying to figure out how to name these things and workshopping with the broader parties, because it is really difficult naming stuff. It's one of the top 3 things in software that's difficult, and it's also really difficult in design to name stuff. And I wish I could just pick up a book and just be like, oh yeah, we'll just do it like they did and we're finished, but you can't. It's much harder than that. Now I'll give you a bit of an insight why. So let's look at this thing. It's platform agnostic. I don't need to use dashes. I can use dots, whatever I want. So button, dot primary, dot color, and I can point to another design token and then compose them together. And at this point, you're probably going, oh yeah, that looks pretty simple. And you're like, yeah, but we should probably make sure it doesn't clash with other people. We know where it came from. So let's put the name of the company there. So MC for my company. I couldn't think of anything better. So my company.button.primary.color points to my company.color.primary. And then we go on and we say, oh, we should probably say what level it's at. So we're dealing with a component level, and that's important because I get context. But the other side's at a reference level, and every company uses different names for component and reference. It's just wild. And so this reference level is kind of higher up. It's reused by more, it's more common, but this component level is more low level. So I kind of want that context, and it's starting to get a lot more verbose. And then I go, oh, but what if this is the primary color on a dark surface? And then it gets harder, yeah. And you can see where I'm going with this. And then what if it's on a dark surface, but you're also hovering on this dark surface, and now you've got a token on a dark hovered surface, and you're like, oh yeah, WTF, Duncan, you don't do this, do you really? That's a terrible name. But if you go look at more things in the wild, this is from Material Design. They've got some good docs. They've only started this journey themselves. They've only gotten to colors and typography, but they've got examples of lots of things. So they go MD for Material Design, and then they've got component for the level, fab for the actual component, secondary for the variant, and then they're talking about label text, and then they're talking about the actual font of the label text. So you're going to end up looking at this going, oh, it just seems too much, and that's a challenge we have to express to all the design parties, that we've reached this point because verbose names give us all the context and we can scale. But it's tricky. There is a design group on W3C. They've just started. I think this is a little out of date. I think they've just released their next draft the other week. But unfortunately, there's not enough there yet for us just to pick it up and use their standards. So we have to come up with ours, and we have to spend the time to do it. We're mostly there. We're all excited about it, but it's taken time. But again, it's really important. I'm put on my, a web developer hat, but it's really important between the both parties of designers and developers. It's like that glue between the two, because there's that air gap where we're copying and pasting code across, and there's that communication gap where we're not necessarily working as one team, sharing that code base and that language properly unless we have these sorts of design tokens. So you might not use web components at all, but this design token stuff might be interesting to you to start emulating at your work. So the other thing that I'm realizing from this is that I probably need to step back from this journey as the web developer, because I'm kind of downstream of a lot of this action upstream with the designers and the decision making, and I'm trying to let go of the naming and let them do it all. But as a developer, naming, it's close to our hearts. We like to argue about it for hours, but I feel like I need to let go of it and let them be in charge so that it will flow down to us. Otherwise, we're not going to build this awesome team. So we use a DSP. Who's heard of a DSP before? Okay, nobody. All right, so it's kind of new. So this is from Adobe. A DSP is a standard, basically, for getting your design tokens into JSON. You're going to have to figure out a way to do this. Adobe use it because they made it. Material Design recommended. It's on their docs, and we're using it. It's a kind of a fringy space, but this is how we get our design tokens into code. And I'll walk you through it now, but basically it's a standard, it's open source, and it looks like this. So we have our designers and developers in Visual Studio Code open up the XD plugin that you get, just like a normal plugin in your Visual Studio Code editor. And XD has a WYSIWYG style GUI that you can author tokens and documentation in Markdown and code snippets for your components and all of those sorts of things. It, under the covers, goes to JSON, and then you can compile it out to whatever platform you want. So it kind of looks like this. We have a DSP that's its own neutral space for designers and developers to author these tokens. And it can go back upstream to Adobe because they made it. And it can come down from XD, the design tool, into the DSP. We don't do that. That'd be a total mess. But you can go back and forth. But we go from this DSP out to a package manager and through all the normal code stuff. We do a pull request. We do a code review. We run through CI/CD where we compile all these tokens from raw key value pairs out to all the different consumers. So we go to web, and our web people need Sass and they need CSS variables. So it's just a compile step. It's cheap. We just do everything so they can have both. And then there's lots of teams that can have access to that. So it's no longer copying and pasting stuff around, which is really great. And this whole thing would work the same if we just went to mobile as well. They could get Flutter variables out of those design tokens. I know that Flutter's a good choice. Okay. So we can kind of expand our horizon, but this is kind of where I'm going. Just this little guy down here. I need to let go and push this back upstream and think more big picture, because they're not my design tokens. Unfortunately, if I bake them into our component library that's used by lots of devs, unfortunately, it'll never probably make it back upstream, and I would have named them for us, and we'll just copy and paste them into the next library we do, and we're back to square one. So this is solving lots of problems for us. Other really cool thing about this is you can have Visual Studio Code snippets. So our developers, when they npm install into their projects the DSP, they get all these tokens. They can just search in the command palette for a design token, or they can search for a component and they can see company name button spacebar, and they see React Angular button, and they go, oh yeah, I'll take this one, plops it into their IDE, and then they can click on it and it takes them to the docs. So all of that's really cheap to set up. It's pretty cool. Okay, last section, moving on to talking about tools and packaging, because there's a lot of different stuff that you need to do. We don't have a website yet for this because they're expensive to build documentation sites. So when you're building a component in my team, there's actually no website to spin up. All we have is Storybook, and There's a couple of other tools that are unique, but that's one of the big things here is that with Storybook, we're all in. So we use who's using Storybook here? Okay, fair few people. It's kind of the king of the castle in this space. So we use it for everything: develop, review, test, design, sharing with other people, documentation. It's all we really have at the moment. We'll eventually grow up and have enough time to build another documentation site for all of our stuff, but for now it's all in here. So this is what it looks like. It's just a really simple canvas where you can stick a component or a series of components or a whole web page of components on there, and you can change all the attributes so people can go in there and disable it and click on it and see how it all works. You can flip the theme to dark, you can switch to another design system and all these sorts of things. So we invest quite heavily in this. This is just a very basic example of a button, but I think you get the picture. But we use lots of plugins in Storybook, and they're what I think is really cool. So here we have a plugin for taking the design tokens in DSP. It's just a transform step. We annotate those as they come out, and then we can use someone else's plugin to then visually look at those in the Storybook. And if the design token changes, it just recompiles and flows through. So it's really nice. We have an accessibility plugin. So the plugin at the bottom showing you here, you've got some issues with your accessibility. Normally 30 to 50% of those low-level, easy to automate kind of problems with accessibility we can see. Just as we first make our component, we can see it kind of saying it's not accessible yet, and we can have some help there. And we put our docs in here. Stencil's really good. Stencil looks through your code, looks at your JS docs in there, and makes a really good README. This is a very miniature one, but all your properties, events, and so forth. And it makes a README file. So for us, we just make a component, we make a story file, and we make a README file, and the story file just points to this, and we have a tab. So anyone who wants to dive into our docs, they're there, and we don't have to write any documentation side either. It's quite good. So moving on from Storybook, another tool or a process or a thing that you're going to have to decide on is how are you going to do a mono repo, because you're probably going to end up needing one. If you're lucky, you just ship core components, but it's probably unlikely. You're probably going to ship core components and then a React version of those core components and an Angular version of those core components, and there's three different packages. And then you might have specific packages for icons maybe, but then as soon as you bring on another design system and you want to have a package for that just for the components that are just for that other design system, then you're going to need another package and another Angular, another rack. So straight away it's 6 or 7, and then you've got 5 design systems or 8 design systems. And we compile a lot of this. We don't necessarily maintain that code, but you need a tool for being able to deal with that. So we took off with Learner, and then it's interesting, at kind of middle or start of this year, Learner kind of died, and then we were like, oh, we're going to move on, and then NX kind of bought over the ownership, or became the custodians of Learner. But it was too late for us. We just went with NPM Workspaces. It's kind of settling down. It's just got this nice terse syntax for being able to handle lots of different packages, and being able to have a shared node modules and all the things we wanted for us. And it's just so much tinier and easier. Love NX, but not this time. Yarn's good. We just went with NPM. Something that helps us because of the simplicity of NPM is Plop. So Plop is a really cool library for being able to have like a little CLI where you can enter in variables and ask to generate files, like generate a component and make a component file, a test file, a story file, and so forth. So we plop our components, and we plop our Angular and React outputs, and we plop whole onboarding of new little stencil kits for people when new design systems come in. So I'm a huge fan of Plop. I find it really good. It kind of balances out this really lightweight ability of NPM Workspaces, and I'll definitely be using Plop and plopping lots of files into future projects. I find it quite a neat utility to use. Handlebars, it's quite good. Who's using Plop? Nobody. Okay, interesting. Everyone's got an awesome framework that's just pumping out their code gen for them. Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to finish off rabbiting on a little bit about these two as well. We use both. We use Sass and we use PostCSS. So we use the Sass for the component level styling, and we use PostCSS for lots of different things. But it's really interesting for me, like several years ago when we started using Sass, it really kind of shined this light on questions? Okay. So we really shine this light on all of this cleanup. It really brought all these new opportunities into our CSS world. We suddenly got namespacing, we got variables, we got nesting, we got all this imports, and us CSS just went to the next level. But now with post CSS for me several years on, I'm kind of going, wow, this has got everything Sass can do and more. I'm kind of seeing that same opportunity to pick up this next level in how we're doing our CSS, because I can do everything Sass can do, but I can do more. And I find when I'm using post CSS, I can use a plugin that will be like, you can go use the latest web standards before they're ready in draft, level 1, 2, 3, for example, and you can choose how brave you want to be pulling in those web standards early. And when I need to go look at how those web standards work, I'm back on the web standards docs, not on the Sass website, learning about what's coming and using it now. And to me, that's awesome. So I really like that. So I think this will probably be my last project where I use Sass. Love it, but I think I'm just going to stay with post CSS. One last quick shout out is to Smashing Magazine. So if you want to, not so much web components, but you want to learn about design systems and you want to go sit for hours with people like Brad Frost and Nathan Curtis in workshops, remotely, they have awesome workshops. Big fan. If you're into design systems, it's really worth checking out. I think it's the spot to go at the moment to learn this space. So in summary, what have we covered today? We had a look at the team that you need to pull this off. We had a look at why we're using web components, and we're bullish on web components. We looked at the stencil library we're using. We looked at design tokens as code, and we looked at some of the tooling. So I just want to say a big thank you for coming to my talk today. And if you're in the hallways or you're having a cool beverage in the evening, come grab me. Love to talk about this stuff, and thank you very much. So I think we finished a little bit early. If anyone wants to ask any questions.
At what scale would you start recommending going down this path?
I think you could start small. I've got friends who do a lot of Blazor. Is that okay?
No.
Okay. Is that Blazor okay? It's fine. Okay. So.
They're all garbage, right?
So I got friends who do a fair bit of Blazor, not SSW. I know Adam loves Blazor, but they have .NET and server-side stuff, and they've got some Razor pages, and they build their headers with web components because they can use it in Angular and .NET. So they've just got a little bit of it. They've been doing this for years, and they get a lot of advantages out of that. So you can do a little bit of it if you need to cut across different platforms, but I am bullish about web components, but you need to have that problem because it's much easier if you're just going to stay in a silo and crush out that framework. Yeah. So the next big jump to where you're making components, I think you'd need to have some wild card, like a big investment in a CMS or something that's just not React or Angular or Vue. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Is it relatively easy to retrofit web components into an existing React library? So rather than looking into web components up front, you continue down React path until a future time, and then you want to adopt web components. Is that?
Yeah, so the question of, like, you've already got lots of React and now you just want to start slowly using web components. Yeah, that is very easy, especially with Shadow DOM, because a lot of that strong barrier of styling is baked into it and native, so it's very easy to pull them in. So, we're going to be putting these things into, big sites that have been running for years, and we're going to start by owning the header because we can own a whole space, and then we'll do buttons and drop downs and all these sorts of things. So yeah, it is easy for that reason because the styles can just be there. But one of the trickier parts is that you already have a global CSS style sheet that comes together as a big style sheet. Those styles won't bleed through for you unless you're using CSS variables, and you don't want them to. So you still have to tackle getting those styles into the existing React system and the web component. Yeah. Yeah.
A few years back, so please I might be vague, I seem to recall some kind of issue around scoping and isolation where we could share stuff across the CSS like you described. Other stuff wouldn't share as composite or something like that. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, and that's
Problems fixed, or is it how it should be?
So the question that you're asking around, previously a few years back, we had a real challenge because we had encapsulation and we could hide our CSS with Shadow DOM, but we couldn't actually get across it very well. So CSS variables are the answer to that as I was mentioning, because they can just natively cut straight across. If you use one inside, it's like it's global. But the stuff around some of the JavaScripts, like the form element and getting in and out of that Shadow DOM, that stuff's close to being fixed, but not perfect yet. But there's ways around most of those things, and they're becoming less and less. So it's much less of a problem. Like, it's realistic in 2022, we're using web components. Lots of people are. As you saw, there's like, between those two libraries, there's almost 1 million downloads a month. So it's much better, and it's getting better, but those inherent problems are still kind of there to deal with because of Shadow DOM. Yeah. But definitely the last 2 years has been just snuck up on us, and now it's a standard. So, yeah. Cool.
I'm wondering how granular you get with the components that you provide to your customers. Because whenever I've looked at design systems, the tutorials invariably sort of show you how to style a button, how to do H1 tags, paragraphs, blah, blah, blah. I work on back office applications, which are really just data tables and forms of varying complexity. And so my concerns with sort of having standard designs are about, how much padding is on fields and, how text boxes lay out in a main page versus a modal sort of context.
Mm-hmm.
Like that. Do you solve those sort of problems with your design system?
I've kicked them out of our team's responsibility to the designers where it should be, and that's what the design tokens do. So the design tokens, when you start, you'll just have helpers like padding, like a scale of spacing, primary colors and so forth. But as you get more rich into it, you will actually also build out tokens for components. So you will have your brand name .modal .padding, and you can actually use a named variable that's standard across the company for the padding on that modal. But that's quite a robust setup. Yeah, that's kind of further down the road when you've got all your components also in tokens. A lot of the time that's just still in a CSS file. So for us, we absolutely tackle that. We make specific CSS files for our components for each of the big players, which is a design system in our space. So we'll have a toggle. You can just pass in a different CSS file for that modal or for that whole brand, and that will then just apply all those styles to all the components for the consumer. So when they use a modal or a button, the developer doesn't think about it. It's already done. They just have the styles there. They just use it. They can override it, but that's the beauty, is that they just plop them on there and they're already styled, ready to go. They might do some layout, bit of spans, like, media queries and stuff, but yeah.
So basically the developer laying out a form, which sort of still draws some divs or spans to say, div label, or even, global label.
Totally, and I think that's really important. I think it's important that we don't solve everything for the developer, or we'll just spin our wheels trying to make websites that are completely configurable, and that's too hard. So we very much pass the buck to the development team for a lot of things. We have a design token for H1s. They can go use it, but we're not going to make a H1 for them. We're not going to position two components next to them, because as soon as we have to account for that decision making, it's just way too difficult to know what they want. So here's a card. You go stick it on your page, and you go, it's got all the perfect padding on it, but how it sits next to the next one, here's something you can copy, but that's up to you, because that's hard to know up front. Yeah. Who's excited for web components? Did I scare everybody off? Oh, okay, people are nice. Most of the hands went up. Yeah, I think it's you can do it now, but it'll get better and better. Yeah, for sure. Any other questions?
What are some live examples that we can check out?
Oh, okay. I think it depends which compiler you're using. Like if you're using Lit or Stencil. So if you're going to be using Stencil, I really like Ionic, because they made it and they've got their own components. So you can just go look through their source control. And there's a couple of other in that space, like crayons. But if you're in the lit space, there's a really awesome open source library that you could just use in your own components. You don't have to write the web component. You could go use it, called Shoelace. So Shoelace is really good. That one's written with lit. So it kind of depends which path you go down, because you're probably going to choose, if you go with Fast UI from Microsoft, they're just starting to kind of open it up to make it more themable and better for everybody. So Fast UI is another one you might have a look at. Yeah. Looking at the time, we're going to finish a few minutes early. That is good. Yep. What's everyone going to next? Don't know.
Coffee machine.
What's that? Coffee machine, nice.
You don't have to worry about IE. There's compatibility mode in Edge. So you can just...
IE is still there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't understand the question. Yeah, it's good that we don't have to deal with that. Yeah, but if you really miss it, I know you get nostalgic about these.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Feel free to grab me whenever over the conference. And enjoy. Cheers.